right, welcome everybody to the Alum Fellows Reading Series. Today we are excited to have alumni LaFleur Stephens-Dougan. He's an assistant professor of politics at Princeton University and a faculty affiliate at the Center for the Study of Democratic Politics. She earned her PhD in public policy and political science from the University of Michigan and her BA in political science from the University of Rochester. Dr. Stephens-Dougan studies American politics, focusing on race and ethnic politics, public opinion, and experimental methods. She is the author of Race to the Bottom, How Racial Appeals Work in American Politics, published by the University of Chicago Press earlier this year, and she'll be speaking on this new book momentarily. Her research has been funded by the Russell Sage Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the National Science Foundation's time sharing in the experimental social sciences. We are also thrilled to have as our discussant, Davin Phoenix. He is an associate professor of political science at the University of California, Irvine. A first-generation college graduate, Davin researches how race interacts with various spheres of US politics to shape people's attitudes, emotions, and behavior. His book, The Anger Gap, How Race Shapes Emotions in Politics, won the American Political Science Association's 2020 Ralph J. Bunche Award for Best Scholarly Work Exploring Ethnic and Cultural Pluralism, and was also co-winner of the 2020 APSA Award for Best Book on Race and Ethnic Politics. Please welcome LaFleur.
Thank you so much for having me, Krishna. It's great to be here. Thank you for that warm introduction. And I'd also, just like to thank a lot of the other staff at the Hutchins Center. So, of course, Abby Wolf and just everyone at Hutchins, of course, Professor Skip Gates. And just as a little background, I am especially appreciative to the folks at the Hutchins Center because during my sabbatical year at the Hutchins Center, that's when I was able to complete the manuscript that I will be discussing today. So let me just go ahead and share my screen and we can go ahead and get started. Okay, so today I'll be speaking about my book, Race to the Bottom, How Racial Appeals Work in American Politics. And just to kind of give a bit of an overview, I'll give a structure of the presentation today. So beginning with the motivation for today's talk, as well as for the book more generally. I'll then discuss the theoretical framework for the book, and then I'll also be discussing an experimental test of the racial priming hypothesis and deracialization theory. So this is just one of many experiments in the book, but I'll just be talking about this one today for the interest of time. And then finally, I'll conclude with a discussion of the results and the implication of these results for American politics. Okay, so invariably, when I tell people that I study racial appeals in American politics or that I wrote a book about racial appeals, they often say, oh, so you're going to be talking about Trump, or this is a great time to be studying that topic. And it is a great time to be studying this topic, but I would argue that by focusing on President Trump, we're sort of missing some of the broader landscape of racial appeals in American politics. And it's kind of easy to understand why people kind of immediately jump to President Trump when I say that I'm studying race in American politics and racial appeals. All right, so you might recall that he said things like African Americans are living in inner cities and they're living in hell, right? He said that, if they walk to the store to get a loaf of bread, that they'll get shot. This is also President Trump who began his campaign in 2015, descending those golden descending that golden escalator at Trump Tower, saying that Mexicans are rapists, that they're bringing drugs, that they're bringing crimes into the United States. And even now, most recently during his 2020 campaign, he asserted that the suburban housewife would vote for him because, quote, they want safety and that they're thrilled that I ended the long running program where low income housing would invade their neighborhoods. Biden would reinstall it in a bigger form with Cory Booker in charge. Right. And so it's perhaps no sort of mistake or no surprise to this audience that he mentions Cory Booker, one of two African American men who's currently serving in the United States Senate. Right. And so this speaks to the way in which President Trump has used explicit and implicit racial appeals in American politics. But what I'm arguing is that the sort of landscape is even wider in terms of who uses racial appeals and why these types of appeals are effective. So, as a bit of a motivation for the talk, I'm going to begin by reading from the manuscript. So, on April 27th, 2015, West Baltimore, Maryland erupted in unrest. The uprisings were in response to the death of Freddie Gray, an African American civilian who died while in police custody under suspicious circumstances. It was not the first time that the nation would be forced to confront the crisis of policing in Black and Brown communities, and it likely would not be the last. Once again, a familiar scene unfolded on television screens across the nation. Black youth clashing with police amidst billowing smoke and flames, placing a national spotlight on race, justice, police brutality, and the distrust between African American communities and their local governments. As was typical of the fallout around other tense racial incidents, the nation was looking to the first Black president to address the racial tension. How would he respond? When racial fissures were previously exposed during his tenure, Obama made an effort to appear tempered and even handed. On the one hand, he would acknowledge and appear sympathetic to African American grievance, largely through symbolic gestures, such as famously saying, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon, or by sending Attorney General Eric Holder to Ferguson, Missouri to address racial unrest in the aftermath of the police shooting of Michael Brown. On the other hand, Obama would acknowledge that the police have a difficult job, while simultaneously criticizing any behavior that could be perceived as violent or destructive. The resulting fallout was usually that Obama was criticized in conservative circles for being anti police, while he faced criticism in liberal circles for being far too silent on an issue that disproportionately affected African Americans. The day after the unrest began in Baltimore, Obama initially avoided commenting on what was only happening only 40 miles away from the White House. Eventually, he made a 14-minute prepared statement during a press conference with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe of Japan. Similar to his response in previous incidents, President Obama reminded the public that the police have a tough job. Obama, however, also condemned, quote, the criminals and thugs who tore up the place, end quote. It was not the first time that the president expressed that he had, quote, no sympathy at all for destroying your own communities. But this time, the president's language was different. His language was more forceful and more racially charged, giving his use of the word thug, a word that carries a racial connotation. Obama, however, was not alone in his use of racially charged language. Obama's word choice was similar to that of his fellow Democrat, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, the African American mayor of Baltimore, who said, quote, too many people have spent generations building up this city for it to be destroyed by thugs, who in a very senseless way are trying to tear down what so many have fought for. End quote. Perhaps more surprisingly, Obama's response was also similar to that of white Republican governor of Maryland, Larry Hogan, who referred to the protesters also as thugs, saying that they were a gang of thugs whose only intent was to bring violence and destruction to the city. All three politicians were united in their use of racially inflammatory language, referring to the protesters as thugs in separate statements. This despite the diversity of their racial and political backgrounds and political constituencies. The word choice drew criticism and scrutiny from some Black lawmakers, including Baltimore City Councilman Carl Stokes, who suggested that thug was racially charged, a euphemism for the N word. Linguist and conservative critic John McWhorter, while not critical of the word choice, also suggested that the word thug carried a racial connotation, saying that it was a nominally polite way of using the N word. And he said this during an interview with National Public Radio. In the face of the criticism over the use of the word, Mayor Rawlings Blake walked back her use of the term, saying, quote, "There are no thugs in Baltimore. Sometimes my own little anger translator gets the best of me," end quote. President Obama, however, doubled down on his use of the term, communicating through White House spokesman Josh Earnest that he did not regret using the term. Obama, however, was responsible to a national electorate that was predominantly white. Rawlings Blake had an urban electorate that was overwhelmingly African American, which might explain why Rawlings Blake chose to back down from her statement while Obama doubled down on the use of the term. Using the word, I argue, had political utility, communicating to Americans that these elected officials were taking a no nonsense approach to crime that was being perpetrated by mostly Black youth. Hogan was reinforcing his party's reputation for being tough on crime, while Obama and Rawlings Blake were distancing themselves from their party's reputation for being soft on crime. Obama and Rawlings Blake were also eschewing any presumed racial allegiance with the protesters, who were overwhelmingly African American. This is just one of many examples of how politicians across the racial and political spectrum engage in a political strategy that I refer to as racial distancing, often in surprisingly similar ways. So, racial distancing is the phenomenon whereby politicians communicate to racially moderate and racially conservative whites that they will not disrupt the racial status quo. And by racial status quo, I'm referring to what's characterized by racial inequality, with white Americans at the top of the hierarchy, including white dominance in political, social, and economic institutions. And so in the book, I put forth what I refer to as the theory of racial distancing. And it's the idea that in majority white jurisdictions, candidates have an incentive to indicate that they will not cater to Black interests, but they must also show that they are not racially insensitive. And the constraints that candidates face vary depending on both their race and their partisanship. And I'll explain a little bit more about what this entails. I'm building my theory of racial distancing from some of the previous research that has been conducted in race and politics, namely the theory of racial priming and the racial priming hypothesis, as well as the theory of deracialization. And so, racial distancing theory that I promote in the book actually challenges much of the existing work, including this racial priming hypothesis. So the racial priming hypothesis would state that in the post-civil rights era, that people across the political spectrum reject what are referred to as explicit racial appeals. And explicit racial appeals are those that use racial nouns. So, for example, referring to Black people or African Americans or Mexicans as rapists, things of that nature. And according to the racial priming hypothesis, these explicit racial appeals are almost universally viewed as violating the norm of racial equality or any sort of prohibition against racist speech. And so the conventional wisdom is that if a candidate uses an explicit appeal, then that candidate will inevitably lose the support of voters. But, as I'm saying this, you might think this doesn't actually comport with what we see in actual contemporary American politics. Going back to that example of President Trump, for a non trivial fraction of Americans, they seem largely unperturbed by his use of some of these more explicit racial appeals. And so my book, in many ways, helps to explain why this happens and to explore why it is that many Americans are quite comfortable or unperturbed by these types of racial appeals and appeals that especially traffic in an anti-Black racism. The theory of racial distancing also challenges what's referred to as deracialization theory, right? And so deracialization theory states that Democratic candidates, especially African American candidates, should avoid any sort of discussion of race altogether. And it's the idea that they're going to deny Republicans the opportunity to use race as a polarizing issue. In other words, if they avoid any sort of discussion of race, then Republicans can't accuse them of being too liberal on racial issues. But what deracialization theory does not take into account is that Democratic politicians might actually talk about race, but not in a manner that is actually racially liberal, but instead in a manner that might distance them from any sort of liberal civil rights agenda. So why would they racially distance? I argue that racial distancing helps Black politicians and white Democratic politicians disrupt the stereotype of them being beholden to racial and ethnic minorities, right? The idea that these groups of politicians are going to be especially sympathetic to the interests of racial and ethnic minorities, and by doing so, they would disrupt what I referred to earlier as that racial status quo. On the other hand, white Republican politicians are also incentivized to engage in this type of behavior. But in this case, it's to help reinforce their reputation for keeping intact the existing racial hierarchy. And so, to give some illustration for why these different types of politicians are incentivized in these different ways, I actually fielded an experiment on a group of 653 white Americans, and this is a nationally representative sample of white Americans. And basically, people were randomly assigned, and I can talk a little bit more about what that entails, but to rate different types of politicians on how they treat different racial groups in American society. So they were asked about where Black Democrats stand, Black Republican politicians, white Democratic politicians, and white Republican politicians. And um, what you can take from this is essentially that anything above a zero point 0.5 means that they perceived the candidate as being more likely to favor whites over Blacks. Below a zero point 0.5 indicates that they thought that the candidate or that type of politician would be more likely to favor Blacks over whites. And at the zero point 0.5 mark, it's the idea that they would treat both groups the same. And so the takeaway really from this figure is that there are different sort of meanings or cues that people are taking from the different types of politicians with regard to their reputation on matters of race. So, for example, a Black Democratic politician is much closer to the end of the spectrum that suggests that they would actually favor Blacks over whites, whereas white Republicans are closer to the end of the scale that suggests that they would favor whites over Blacks. And I argue that this is actually very sort of central to how we think about American politics and how people align with the different parties, right? So we kind of say, you know, for shorthand in American politics, that politics is really about who gets what, when, and how. And what we see here in this figure is that there's a sort of different reputation for different types of politicians in terms of who they think will give what to which group. Another reason why we might expect that candidates would engage in sort of this racial distancing behavior is due to the parties, to voters' perceptions of which party and types of politicians own the issue of race. So every year, that the American National Election Study is fielded, they ask a question about which party do they think, you know, favors giving aid to Blacks. And sort of the takeaway here is that sort of along this bottom uh, line is the perception of the Republican Party's stance on aid to Blacks. So we can see that most people don't perceive the Republican Party as very likely to give aid to Blacks. This is respondents' own opinion, white Americans that is, on the party's likelihood of giving aid to Blacks. Again, very much closely tracking with their perception of the Republican Party. But when you look at their perception in this dark line of the Democratic Party, they're much more likely to perceive the Democratic Party as owning this issue of giving aid to Blacks. And this is important because what we see here is a major sort of departure between what they perceive the Democratic Party doing and where their own opinion stands and where they perceive the Republican Party. So, insofar as people's perception about which party is going to give aid or benefits to particular groups is popular or unpopular, we can see that the Democratic Party's position is unpopular, which might help explain why some Democratic politicians want to sort of eschew uh, that reputation, particularly when reaching out to white American voters. And you could see some of this discussed in this most recent election cycle in terms of how would the Democratic Party balance their outreach to communities of color with also trying to get that sort of elusive white American swing voter, particularly those who might have switched from Obama to Trump in 2016. And I can say more about that maybe during the Q&A. And then again, politicians might engage in racial distancing due to this idea that only Nixon can go to China, or the idea that politicians who are seen as speaking out against their own self-interest, in this case, Democrats or maybe African American politicians of either major party would be seen as speaking out against their own interests if they speak out against other African Americans. In the interest of time, I'm going to kind of just uh, speed through some of these next slides. But racial distancing, it can be both rhetorical, visual, even substantive, and it often invokes negative stereotypes. And it can be, of a visual nature. So I have one of my favorite examples here. This is Harold Ford Jr. He was a former congressman from Memphis, Tennessee. And this was when he was running for statewide office back in 2006. And he's African American, but you can also see that he's prominently pictured giving a thumbs up outside of an establishment that has a prominent Confederate flag. And what I want you to take away from this is that these Black politicians, when they're trying to pursue office in majority white jurisdictions, are sometimes incentivized to engage in this type of racial distancing or signaling that they won't be too beholden to their African American constituents. So I test a series of hypotheses. Uh, One being that a Black Democratic candidate with an implicit or explicit message would actually garner more electoral support than a Black Democratic candidate with a deracialized message. And again, just to refresh your memories, explicit messages are those that would have the racial noun like Black or African American, whereas an implicit message might use more sort of racially coded language. So something like urban or inner city, where they don't explicitly use a racial noun, but due to sort of how we think about American politics, we know that when they're saying inner city, that it's actually referencing African Americans. And then the second hypothesis is that a Black Democratic candidate with an explicit message uh, will not lose electoral support relative to an implicit or deracialized message. And so to test these hypotheses, I fielded an experiment on a nationally representative sample of 500 white Americans via a firm known as knowledge networks, and this was done online. And subjects were randomly assigned to one of three messages: that sort of deracialized universal message that, according to deracialization theory, should be most popular, an implicit message that referenced inner city voters, and an explicit message that referenced Black voters, again, using that racial noun. They read an article about a candidate who was running for governor who was giving a speech about getting out the vote. and there was a 1 week lag time between the pre and the post test. So in the deracialized appeal, they get this article where the headline reads, Democratic candidate to voters get to the voting booth. Again, this is deracialized because there's no mention of race. He's avoiding race in this article. And just as like sort of a snippet, I don't provide the whole article here, but he says something to the effect of, if elected, I will continue to create jobs that offer a hand up for everyone across the state. Again, this idea that it's universal, that there's no sort of racial favors being given. Whereas in the implicit appeal, the Democratic candidate says to inner city voters, quit complaining and get to the voting booth. If elected, I will continue to create jobs that offer a hand up and not a hand out, right? So this is different than this hand up for everyone across the state. Again, it's playing to some of these stereotypes about sort of welfare dependency among African Americans. There's more language in the article, but I'm just giving you a snippet. And then again, similar to the explicit appeal, it's all of the same language as in the implicit version, except that there's the mention of the racial noun Black. And what I subsequently did is ask people about how likely they would be to vote for the candidate whose message they saw and what rating they gave to the speech. And for those of you who might not be familiar with experiments, what the experiment allows us to do is that any sort of difference that we see in terms of how they rated the speech or how likely they were to vote for the candidate, we can know through a process of random assignment, essentially, that any sort of difference that we see between likely voter speech rating is because of the message. That is to say that the articles are identically the same, except for some minor tweaking of the language. And um, I use something called a regression model where basically people were required to say how likely they were to vote for the candidate on a scale of 0 to 100 and to also rate the speech on a scale from 0 to 100. Um, and so the higher the rating, the more likely they were to vote for the candidate, and the higher the number, the more positively they rated the speech. And so the takeaway here is that in sort of that deracialized universal version, their likelihood of voting for the candidate on average was at about 52. So essentially like a coin toss. But when they got exposed to either the explicit or the implicit message, they were actually more likely to vote for the candidate. And this doesn't really comport with what some of the previous theories have stated, which is that sort of a deracialized universal message would be the most popular. But actually, a message that plays to negative stereotypes of African Americans, whether implicitly or explicitly, was actually notably more popular on that scale of 0 to 100. And similarly, we see that with the rating of the speech. I also looked at it by the partisanship of the respondents. And again, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through this rather quickly. But the point being that whether people identified as Democrats or Republicans, the deracialized message was actually the least popular. And by using a message that invoked these stereotypes, they were actually more likely to vote for the candidate and more likely to rate the speech positively. And I want to be clear, I'm not suggesting that this should be a strategy that candidates employ. I'm not offering a sort of prescriptive idea about campaign strategy here. What I'm saying, though, is that this is an indictment, essentially, of the American electorate, that messages that either implicitly or explicitly play to these negative stereotypes about African Americans are actually more popular with a non-trivial fraction of of white American voters than a message that essentially talks about universalism or downplays any sort of racial polarization or division. I also look at this by a function of people's racial attitudes, and really what we're seeing here, again, because of the interest of time, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but the point being is that for people who had either sort of neutral attitudes towards African Americans or who had explicitly anti-Black attitudes, they were much more likely to vote for this Black Democratic candidate when he used an implicit or explicit message. And so, what should we take from this? One, that Black candidates might be incentivized to go above and beyond a strategy of deracialization. That is to say, that rather than engage in sort of that race neutral universal message, they might actually want to invoke stereotypes about their sort of own in group. What we saw there is that the deracialized message was consistently the least popular among white voters relative to a message that either implicitly or explicitly invoked stereotypes of African American voters. And I'd also conclude by saying that previous theories have not really accounted for the unique ways in which the candidate's race and partisanship can either facilitate or hinder the use of racial cues. So this is just sort of one snapshot from the book, but within the book, I go into more detail and more examples of how even prominent politicians have invoked or played to some of these negative stereotypes for political gain and increased electoral support. So I'll end it there, but again, thank you.
Thank you, LaFleur. Thank you very much. If you have questions or comments, please put them in the Q&A section of your screen, and we'll get to the questions after the conversations. So, Davin, would you like to proceed?
Yes, thank you to the Hutchinson for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with a good friend of mine whose book I'm a big fan of. I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for audience Q&A, so I'll just ask a couple of these questions. But LaFleur, what was your initial motivation for pursuing this project?
So my initial motivation for this project is kind of, I don't want to say embarrassing to say, but now that it's 2020 and the book is finally published, as you well know, you write a dissertation and it takes quite some time for it to develop from sort of that initial dissertation idea into a book. And I initially became interested in this basically after Obama's speech at the 2004 Democratic National Convention. You might recall he said things along the lines of, you know, it's not acting white for a Black kid, to pick up a book. Um, and I thought this kind of played to a stereotype that we often hear about, African Americans, and put forth a sort of narrative of cultural pathology. And I was just interested in exploring to what sort of political utility that type of messaging could be for African American candidates, but for candidates more broadly. And this is not necessarily the most popular statement, especially now, I think, given what we see with the Trump presidency. But part of my argument is that even Obama sometimes played to some of these negative stereotypes, whether it was referring to African American men as cousin, Ray Ray, or, Uncle Ray Ray, or cousin Pookie, and, talking about, getting off the couch, putting on, your bedroom slippers and stop complaining, things of that nature. He, had said things like this to African American audiences. And part of my motivation for the book is, what happens when that audience or that type of messaging goes beyond sort of the in-group audience of African Americans and to a wider, more sort of mainstream audience, and whether that type of messaging has political utility outside of that sort of immediate Black audience to which it's delivered. And so that's a lot of what I explore throughout the book.
Absolutely. And the book really makes that point abundantly clear, right? That these kinds of strategies of distancing yourself from Black interests or possibly even denigrating Black people is by no means limited to this kind of Trump era or even the post-Obama era. That said, how has the increased salience of race and racism, maybe not if even in the Trump era generally, but maybe in the immediate aftermath of this summer of unrest of 2020, how does that maybe shift the use of racial signaling? Do you think there could be greater scrutiny of officials, particularly Black Democrats, that in this moment use such signals? Or alternately, do you think such officials can engage in even more blatant forms of signaling, maybe without suffering large penalty?
Wow, that's a good question. So I'll say that at some certain points, I've been maybe even a bit panicked as we've seen sort of a very wide sort of shift in the racial landscape in American politics. So, when I was initially writing this book, Obama was still president, and I would argue we had a very different racial landscape than the one in which we, have witnessed with the Trump presidency. That is not to say that, people didn't have prejudicial attitudes, but the way in which they were appealed to were arguably different during the Obama era. And I would argue that this year that we've seen of essentially a racial reckoning has, I think, made it more difficult for Democratic candidates in particular to use that type of racial messaging or to engage in any sort of racial distancing because there is such this sort of groundswell among particularly young people against anything that is seen as perpetrating racism. And so to that end, I think Democratic candidates are much more constrained in some ways in their ability to use this type of messaging at this current political moment because there's more likely to be some sort of potential backlash. And I think we see this borne out with, a Joe Biden campaign in which, there was a lot of push, for example, for him to have an African American running mate, even if that might just be largely symbolic. There was the sense from, I think, the base that another white candidate was not going to cut it on the ticket this year, and I think that's in part because of the current racial moment. um, Even after the Republican National Convention, where there was lots of efforts on the part of the Republican Party to portray Biden as being soft on crime and maybe being too beholden to his constituents of people of color, he has gone to great lengths to make distinguish between sort of protesting and rioting, and to um, suggest that systemic racism is a thing, but at the same time being clear that he's not especially liberal. And I think that's sort of the delicate balance that politicians face, and speaks to this idea that there are different constraints that they're going to face because of both race and partisanship.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, there's a couple of directions I could go into based on that, but I'll kind of lock in on the addition of Kamala Harris to the VP ticket. Would you say your book offers a pretty kind of definitive account of why Kamala Harris is a clearer choice for the Democratic Party to be a Black woman on this ticket compared to someone like Stacey Abrams or Karen Bass? Because as you touched on in the book, that kind of record she has as prosecutor in the criminal justice system could be an effective signal to white voters.
Yes. So we see with her background as a prosecutor, right, that she's able to maybe insulate herself from some of those charges that the Trump campaign was trying to make of the Biden Harris ticket. That is to say, Trump often talked about if Biden and Harris were elected, that they were going to defund the police, that low income people were going to invade their suburbs and things of that nature. But a critique like that or an accusation like that has a little less weight, I would argue, given that she could easily point to her background as essentially California's top cop. And she often referred to herself, maybe a little less so now, given our current political moment, but she did refer to herself as, California's top cop, and the idea that she was smart on crime. Um, and I think all of these are ways in which, particularly a Black candidate can try to insulate themselves from this idea that they'd be too racially liberal, that they'd be beholden to their racial and ethnic minority constituency. And this is something that they often have to consider, given that it's sort of very easy for the Republican Party to paint them as being too aligned with an agenda of racial liberalism.
Sure. Yeah. I'll try to sneak one more question in before Q&A. So to kind of switch gears a little bit, we can think about the efforts of Stacey Abrams and many Black community activists and organizations in Georgia to turn Georgia blue, the vigorous efforts to register and mobilize Black voters. Do you see that as a potential pathway to maybe Black Democrats in particular winning office without relying on racial signaling to distance themselves from Black interests? Or do you think that racial signaling will continue to be prevalent in the face of renewed efforts to conduct outreach to Black disaffected voters? Hopefully you're still with us here. Let's see, did we lose you?
Maybe she's going to try
Okay,
and
reconnect.
come back again. Yes. We'll give her a minute. There she is.
Okay, can you hear
Hi,
us?
sorry about that. I
No
saw that
problem.
my battery was dying and didn't make it back just in time. Sorry.
Okay, all right. Very good. So kind of asking about what kind of model Georgia provides, right? Where we had these kind of renewed, spirited efforts to shift the state blue by registering and mobilizing Black people that had long been ignored by the Democratic Party. Do you think that's a viable pathway for Democrats, maybe Black Democrats, to win higher office without relying on racial signaling? Or do you still think even in the face of that kind of attentiveness to Black disaffected voters, we'll still see racial signaling play a significant part in strategizing?
Well, I can't pretend to know what, these candidates will do, but what I can say is, and I talk about this at length in the book, is that um, we haven't really seen a blueprint for how this works necessarily because at least at the sort of national level, the Democratic Party hasn't necessarily been willing to try what I think they perceive as a risky strategy. So we've seen with Abrams that model in Georgia, she was able to turn Georgia blue. And I actually talk about what she was able to do in 2018 without knowing that Georgia would go blue, in the book. But what I think this speaks to is that the Democratic Party has historically had sort of this obsession with that sort of moderate white swing voter. And so much of that strategy has been about not alienating them, trying to win back that particular segment of white voters, Reagan Democrats, as they're sometimes called, who, historically had voted Democrat, but had, with increasing frequency in the post-civil rights era, moved over to the Republican Party. And part of why they've moved over to the Republican Party, as many political scientists have speculated, is because of the Democratic Party's position on race, or the perception that the Democratic Party was too liberal on race. And so there's been an emphasis, I think, in party strategy to try to reach back out to those voters and to try to win them back over. And this is often through a lot of the sort of rhetorical messaging, as well as, visual messaging, you know, maybe not mentioning race in the party's platform prominently in 92 when Clinton ran for the presidency, or, um, you know, Obama in 2008 when he ran. There's a very interesting study that looks at this, but he ran an ad called "Country That I Love," in which people of color were completely absent from the ad, and all of these are examples of strategies in which there's that distancing from race, and I would argue it's about trying to reach out to those moderate white voters. But there is another option, and that is to maybe drive turnout among people of color. And this is something that I've argued, or talked about quite a bit. So in 2016, when you see Hillary Clinton losing, and she lost, by what, 70,000 votes in 3 states. There's this concern about, like, how would Biden, or any sort of presidential candidate for the Democratic ticket, win back places like Pennsylvania or Wisconsin or Michigan. And I would always say, yes, he needs to, or any candidate would have to win back those states, but that there is lots of people of color in places like Philadelphia and Detroit and Milwaukee. And so that strategy about, winning back some of those swing states doesn't necessarily have to rest on trying to appeal to moderate whites. And you can drive turnout, as we've seen with this most recent election, by appealing to people of color in key places as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you're not just kind of painting a damning portrait of the electorate, but you're also painting to a viable alternate pathway. So I want to make sure we leave room for Q&A. So I will kind of give the floor to Krishna to field questions that have come in from the attendees.
Thank you so much, Davin and LaFleur. There are a lot of really great questions, and some people have many questions. So I'm going to try to be fair and let everyone's voices be heard at least once. So Jennifer Huckshield asks, how do you explain the increase in Trump votes among Blacks, mostly men, and Latinos, also I think mostly men, in 2020 compared with 2016?
Okay, thank you for that. I don't have necessarily the data to bring to bear on this, but my speculation would be that, for one, uh, there's probably some role for sexism or misogyny at play here, where there's um, where the type of messaging that Trump has engaged in might appeal to a non-trivial fraction of men of color, in terms of this idea of protecting womanhood and just some old sort of gendered tropes that he's engaged in that might be attractive to some of those people. And also, they're not necessarily immune from any sort of negative messaging or stereotypes about their own groups. And so they too could be susceptible. Why this has increased from 2016 to 2020? In some ways, it's interesting because I would argue he's also maybe toned down some of the rhetoric, if you might imagine. So in some ways it was not quite as explicit. So the notion of the suburban housewife, he's not really using, he's not using, the explicit terms. We know who he's talking about when he says suburban housewife, but it's, a bit more implicit. Low income voters, same thing. He doesn't necessarily go right out and say Black people or people of color. And so for those reasons, he might have been maybe somewhat more attractive to some of those voters between 2016 and 2020.
Thank you. Crystal Williams says, thank you for a great presentation. And she asks, from your research, have you found that the practice of racial distancing differs based upon the audience? For example, might Obama's practice of racial distancing be more prominent for a white audience versus an all Black audience?
Okay, well, I'll say that in the book, one thing that I did look at actually was specifically Obama's messaging and the use of certain types of words that are sort of signals around race and how that varied depending on whether he was talking to a Black audience, a white audience, or a predominantly Latino audience. And what I did is I looked at words like, hard work, personal responsibility, culture, fatherhood, things of that nature that, while not necessarily explicitly racial, we know have been often invoked as tropes about um, black people in particular, things like no excuses rhetoric. And what I found is that he was more likely to engage in that type of messaging when he was talking to Black audiences. So there was a higher rate of things like no excuses and the term personal responsibility when he engaged with Black audiences than with white audiences. And actually, in many instances, the frequency of that type of messaging or those words were similar with Latino audiences relative to Black audiences. And so my point there is that, some people might say, like, well, he's using those messages with those groups because they need to hear it more. But what we see from some of the experimental tests is that when he used that type of messaging, or maybe not him necessarily, but a Black candidate used that type of messaging with audiences of color, it made the candidate in the experiments more popular with white voters.
Thank you. And Davin, feel free to jump in at any point. Martha Patterson asks, have you tracked the effect of explicit and implicit racial appeals over time? To what extent do particular events, protests, economic decline, demographic changes affect the degree to which white Americans positively respond to these explicit and implicit racial appeals?
I actually have not tracked the use of those appeals over time, but I think that's, I think Martha has laid out a good potential research agenda for someone to pick up. What we do know, though, is that as the United States has witnessed great demographic change, that you have from survey data indications that many white Americans are more willing to say things like, white people are more likely to be victims of racism than people of color, and I think a greater expression of just a sort of general grievance that we might not have seen in survey data before. And so it might suggest that there is more receptivity to these types of messages as we witness a browning of the United States. And there's also speculation that people became more receptive to these types of messages under an Obama presidency because there was, a perception essentially that we elected a Black president and, you know, race was no longer an issue or a problem, which might have made people feel more comfortable to express some of this messaging. It's really hard to test because we don't necessarily have data tracking the same people over time to see how their attitudes might have changed during these different periods of time. Um, so we can't really say with any certainty. And there's also a suggestion that, people might have held these attitudes, but have just felt more comfortable. So it's not necessarily that their attitudes changed, but there was a less of a concern about social desirability.
Thank you. Maisha Cherry writes, is it possible to talk to your community as a national politician without engaging in or being read as engaging in the messaging you are describing? It seems,
Sorry, can you repeat it one more time, the beginning?
sure. Is it possible to talk to your community, quote unquote,
Oh,
as a national politician without engaging in or being read as engaging in the messaging you are describing?
okay. Hi, Maisha. So we were fellows together at the Hutchins Center during our year. So I think it's possible to engage. We can't pretend to know the political motivations necessarily for why any politician uses that type of message. And I talk about in the book how that sort of message is actually quite popular often among African Americans, right? It's not something that they wouldn't necessarily hear at the barbershop or the beauty salon or, from the pulpit on, Sunday at church. But what's different now is that they sort of have a larger microphone with this type of messaging as they run for office in outside of majority Black jurisdictions with increasing number. And so um, it's not so much whether it's being read a particular way, but rather that there's access to that type of message outside of um, their community or the Black community in the instance of Black candidates. And so when that message does reach beyond their sort of proximate audience of African Americans, what I'm looking at is how then do white voters receive that type of message? And so, for many people, they would say, well, he's just saying it for the good of the community, or, it's a tough love message. It's, well intended. And I'm not necessarily trying to disentangle whether it is, what the motivations are, but really just looking at what that does for them electorally. And it suggests that for Black politicians in particular who do engage in that type of message, there's electoral gains or returns for that type of messaging.
Thank you. Denise Rayner asks, do you think that the consistent use of the term white working class, particularly by the press, is also a racialized term, which implies that Blacks are not an important part of the working class?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I hate to keep on saying I'll talk about it in the book, but I do mention this in the book that by using the term white working class, there's again the perception that people of color, particularly Black people, who stereotype of sort of laziness and poor work ethic has been ascribed to, suggests that sort of hard work and virtue are being conflated with whiteness in a way that it's not then ascribed to African Americans. And so I personally make great effort to go to great lengths in my own writing and research not to use that term. So I might refer to, whites without a college degree or something, if that's who we were talking about. But this notion that there's a specific white working class, no, we have class and it tends to be conflated with race in the United States. But yeah, I try to avoid that myself.
Thank you. Abby Wolf says, excellent talk, LaFleur. Thank you so much. And she says, I was glad Davin brought up Kamala Harris and that you've mentioned misogyny, because I'm also thinking about Kamala Harris in the terms you've laid out. What impact, if any, does gender have on racialized or de-racialized appeals? We heard a lot about Howard and her Black sorority, in addition to hearing about some of her stances as California's top cop.
Right. So I think one of the things that I wasn't able to explore in the book is sort of this intersection of race and gender. So in my studies, all of the candidates were always depicted as men, but there is, there's reason to suspect or believe that these racial appeals might work differently when we take into both account both race and gender. And as a side note, Davin and I are actually working on a project in which we look at just that. But for Kamala Harris and the role of gender, I think we haven't seen it completely play out yet. Surprisingly, some of the more sort of egregious type of attacks that I thought we would have witnessed, we didn't necessarily see, but I think we have quite a bit of time and they're likely to be at that intersection of race and gender, maybe playing to stereotypes of African American in particular, with things around, sexual promiscuity, given sort of her relationship with Willie Brown previously, or things of anger. And I think, we could see even in that vice presidential debate that she might have gone to great lengths at points to level pointed attacks, but at the same time, ones that wouldn't stereotype her as sort of that angry Black woman. And even when we think back to the Democratic debates, when she kind of challenged Biden, a lot of like the press after was like, that she attacked him, or it was language that in some ways many might argue was quite gendered. So there's ways in which I think she'll be susceptible to certain types of attacks because of that intersection of race and gender. But at the same time, there's also ways in which she maybe is able to capitalize on that race and gender to mobilize and excite Black women who we know are the most loyal supporters of the Democratic Party.
Thank you. Will Pruitt, a current fellow, asks, Trump infamously claimed he was the least racist person in the room during his last debate with Biden. He has repeatedly claimed that the HBCUs have received more funding from his presidency than any previous one. He has also touted the decrease in Black unemployment during his presidency. Would you hypothesize that whites give white Republicans more space to appeal to Black voters than white Democrats?
Yes. And so again, this goes back to that theory. I don't, there's only so much of that I could have covered in the course of the talk. But yes, there is something about both the intersection of race and partisanship. And so previously, a lot of the work in race and politics kind of, not all, but a lot of it has kind of just focused on a Black candidate or white candidate without taking into account what that partisan signal also does. And so for white Republican politicians who are associated with a party that's perceived as being largely racially conservative and maybe even arguably the party of whites, there's a greater sort of latitude that they have on the other side of being able to maybe do more outreach and to be able to make sort of inroads with the Black community that arguably a Black candidate of either party or particularly any sort of Democratic politician would not be able to do.
Thank you. Artilda Collins writes, thank you for sharing your data. I found it counterintuitive and discomforting. Do these appeals still have relevance if made by appointed officials, i.e., a Surgeon General? Do they say or speak to any particular party's default standing?
Okay, so what I take from that, I guess, is a question as to whether we might see any type of messaging like this have resonance when the politician is not elected but appointed and maybe might not have electoral considerations at play. So, you know, they use the example of the Surgeon General and um, Jerome Adams, I think maybe some of you might recall, came to attention, I think, during some of the rising cases of COVID in the spring, where he had made some messages about, not killing your big mama or your abuela, again, signaling to both Black and Latino communities about some of their behavior around COVID. And he's not elected, so there's maybe no political utility for him per se, but perhaps for the administration that he was a part of, if he's able to frame sort of racial disparities around COVID as ones that were happening because of individual behavior rather than structural factors, then I guess that affords some political benefit to a Trump administration in this case, but could likely play out similarly for a Democratic administration as well.
Can I just really quickly add to that? Because I thought, LaFleur, of how in your book you speak to, among other political officials, using these distancing cues, Ben Carson, right? And so obviously he ran for president, but kind of when he first became a darling in conservative circles, I think was when, long before he had any explicit ambitions for a presidential run, at that national prayer breakfast, right? Where he excoriated Obama, as you know, with Obama just a few seats away. So I thought about that example. And I also thought about Donald Trump, right? Long before he was candidate Trump, when he was still, apprentice mogul Trump, how his kind of keeping up the momentum of the birtherism claims really established his political kind of following, maybe before he had any explicit thoughts to running for office or running again, since he ran in 2000. So I thought about how even if you're not explicitly seeking votes, to rely on this messaging can create an opportunity for you to build a coalition or a potential constituency base. So yeah, just a thought. And again, something that your book addresses, just another plug for the book. A lot of these questions, she really is speaking in depth in the book. So this is going to be a really valuable resource for a lot of people.
Oh, thank you for that. Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, there's ways in which we see this play out. And if you think about the Republican National Convention as well, there was a great effort, I think, to feature often, and this I think goes back to the question about gender as well, you know, a lot of Black male Republicans at that convention, probably more than are, well, a disproportionate number were featured relative to maybe the number that are actually in the party. And one might argue that this is a way to kind of give credibility to the Republican Party and also to insulate from charges of being racist, right? So the idea that, well, like if you have these Black people who have a level of credibility making these claims, then it can't possibly be racist or racially charged.
Thank you. Well, one final question. Lauren asks, does Stacey Abrams have a shot in 2024?
Oh, I think that might be outside of sort of my purview. Yeah, I don't know. That there's a difference between whether I'd like her to have a shot and whether she would actually. But I mean, in all seriousness, right, there was, I think, a lot of support maybe in some circles for her to be Biden's running mate, but ultimately she wasn't chosen. And perhaps, again, this is speculation, but she might have been seen as sort of too liberal on matters of race in a way that would have it would have been easier for, I think, Trump to paint her as a socialist than, say, Kamala Harris, for example.
Yes, I agree. I think we're at the end of our time. This was a fantastic, fantastic session. And thank you so much. And please do keep us apprised of your projects, the joint ones, as well as other individual ones that are brewing and we don't know about.
Oh, well, thank you. And thanks to everyone for tuning in. And it was a lot of fun. Thanks again.
Keep in touch. Thank you
All
so
right.
much.
Will do. Take care.
Bye.